This is a Glowforge, and if you haven't heard of this before, it is a laser cutter. It kind of sits in that middle zone between DIY and professional grade. The reason I say DIY is because it's nice and compact. It comes with really easy to follow software, and it's almost ready to go out of the box. I say professional grade because I know several people who have started entire businesses using this tool. It's a very precise tool with a lot of options. It can cut all sorts of different materials, including wood, leather, plexiglass. It can even engrave metal. So there's a lot of potential inside of this little box. In this video, I'm going to be covering my first couple of months using the tool and sort of my experience with it. I'm going to test out a bunch of different softwares, a bunch of different materials, and just see how it works with my daily workflow. To be clear up front, Glowforge is not sponsoring this video. They didn't ask me to make this video. I decided to make this video because I wanted to share my experience with it, but I am part of their affiliate program. So if you do decide to buy Glowforge, I have a really nice discount code that you can use. Glowforge.com/MichaelAlm will get you up to $500 off your tool, and it also benefits this channel, which is much appreciated. That said, the main reason that I'm making this video is because I'm really excited to have this in my shop and put it through its paces. I want to test out cutting pattern plywood. I want to test out different thicknesses of hardwood. But first, I have a couple things left to set up. The main thing is that I need to vent it out of the building because this thing does produce a lot of smoke. So Glowforge does have an internal fan, but apparently it's pretty loud, and asking some other friends that already have Glowforges, they recommended I get this AC Infinity external fan so that I can keep the unit a little bit quieter in my office. Now, it's admittedly pretty bulky, but I had a plan for that when I designed the office. I made this hole through the wall into the furnace room, and then I also made a hole outside to the great outdoors. Most people tend to put the vent out a window. I don't have a good window in my shop. There's also the option for a filter unit, but you'll have to replace the filters as you go. So for me, this was the most direct route. It's going to be the shortest amount of piping, which means that it'll vent a lot more efficiently. The cool thing about this setup is that now I just have the fan in my furnace room, and so it's not going to be in the way at all in the office, and it'll actually be even quieter. I really like the design of this fan because it comes apart, which means that you can tape the inside, make sure that all the seams are closed. It also means that when the fan gets covered in soot, you can remove it and clean it out so it won't fail over time. I also upgraded the hoses. These are the 4-inch Dust Right hoses from Rockler. They are just a lot easier to work with and less prone to tearing than the foil hoses that come with the machine. And speaking of the machine, there's still a couple of odds and ends to unpack. There's a whole bunch of structures in here just to keep it from moving around during shipping, and there's little parts that you have to remove in a specific order, which were detailed on the Glowforge website. The nice thing is all these orange parts can be kept so that if you have to repackage it later, you can. This black metal piece is called a crumb tray. It helps support your workpiece. And then this is the head of the laser, it's pretty awesome. It just clips in with magnets. With all those pieces in place, it's time to plug it in and test it out. Glowforge functions wirelessly over your Wi-Fi. So the first thing you have to do is set up the Wi-Fi. And then once you have that established, you go through the Glowforge app and everything transfers to the machine automatically. My machine came with a pack of what Glowforge calls proof grade materials. These come with a QR code, and the camera inside of the Glowforge can actually read these so that all the settings are automated. You can obviously put whatever material you want into the Glowforge. This just kind of speeds up the process. I'm not really sure if it's worth it in the long run, but maybe as I'm learning the machine, it makes a lot of sense to use some proof grade stuff. Eventually, I want to do my own designs in this, but to start out with, I just used a Glowforge design. As you can see, it's read that QR code and it's registered that this is medium draft board. It also has all the engrave, score, and cut lines already on there, so I don't really have to do much other than press print and watch it go. So after all that, I forgot to hit the button to turn off the internal fan. So all that noise that you're hearing is actually from the internal fan of the Glowforge, not the newly installed fan, which was actually running at the same time as well. It's really fun to watch this thing go. It's honestly pretty mesmerizing. And this is in real time. This is not sped up at all. It's really quick. This was about a 4-minute print. The proof grade material comes with a backer on it, which is great because when you peel it away, you can see how clean it is. It gets rid of all the scorching marks, and it also it's something that you can purchase. I've found a roll of it online, which I'll share that link below, and you can purchase it so that you can actually apply it to your own materials and get this clean of a look. There are a lot of things that I want to make on the Glowforge, but I decided to start with something easy, like a box for all of the hardware that's left over for transporting the Glowforge in the future. And I found this website called MakerCase, and they have this auto generation of boxes. So you can make finger jointed boxes really quickly and easily. Basically, you just plug in the dimensions that you want. You select whether you want it to be inside or outside dimensions. You select the material thickness, whether you want the box opened or closed, the style of joinery, and how many joints you want. Once you're done with that, you export it to an SVG, and then you can print it out on your Glowforge without any additional steps. I was really happy with how this turned out. It was so easy to design. Seriously, I went from designing it to making it to gluing it together inside of, I don't know, 15 minutes or so. It's really nice to be able to have specialty organizers, especially in the shop. I actually made a couple of these for our kitchen drawers, and I can see myself making loads of them in the future. Next, I want to showcase what I actually think I'm going to be using this tool for mostly, which is iterating, designing quickly, designing on the fly, allowing me to experiment with a cheap recyclable material as opposed to some expensive piece of walnut or something like that. So what I'm doing is I'm designing a desk caddy, and I'm using a software called Studio. This is from my friends over at Shaper. This is a free program that is essentially like Adobe Illustrator Lite. It produces things in vectors and exports them into SVGs and allows you to take simple forms and make them quickly with really precise measurements. As you can see, I'm just using a box from the recycling. I found that the Glowforge cuts cardboard really well, which means if you're making boxes for a product, you can make it on the Glowforge as long as it fits within the size. And it's also a great way to iterate and not feel like you're wasting material. This was going into the recycling anyway, and so I'm able to test fit my parts, make sure that things fit well. And in this case, it took me 4 or 5 versions before I felt like I got my desk caddy in the right shape. So just sat there, redesigned over and over again until I got a version that I was happy with. Now that I have a design that I'm happy with and the files all made, I can transfer that over to other tools. In this case, I'm using it with Shaper Origin to route it out. You could also cut a template out of plexiglass from the Glowforge and use that to template route it. There's loads of ways that you could do this. If you had a CNC machine, you can run it on a CNC. All sorts of different options now that you have a nice SVG. You could even print it out and carve it by hand if you really wanted to. So I know this is a couple steps removed from laser cutting, but you can see that the laser enabled me to make a better piece, even though I'm using some woodworking tools on the back end of it. As I learn Glowforge more and use it more, I really want it to be another tool in the shop as opposed to just the tool that makes things from start to finish. After all, I am a woodworker. I enjoy my time in the shop, so it's cool to experiment with ways to use Glowforge to make the final product better. When I was preparing the office for the Glowforge, I restored this old flat file and turned it into the Glowforge stand. It's going to be holding all the different materials that I'm going to be using on the Glowforge, and so I decided I might as well make some labels for each drawer. This is also a good chance to test the precision of the laser and see how well it worked on paper, which the results kind of speak for themselves. I'm really amazed that it was able to hold on to the center bits in the letters, like in the O's and the A's. You obviously have to use a stencil font for this, but it worked really, really well. Throughout this build series of my office, people have pointed out my mechanical keyboard. I did build this myself. I've gotten a lot of questions in the comments about it. I'll post all the specs down below. It's been a really fun project, but there was one spot on it that felt a little blank. As I was thinking about it, I thought it would be fun to do something sort of pattern plywood-ish, but it looked more like it's a manufactured part of the keyboard, which I thought would be really cool. So I designed something in Adobe Illustrator and then sent it over to the Glowforge to cut out of this black plexiglass that I found online. This is the first material that I'm using that's not proof grade. In order to figure out the settings, I just looked up some stuff on the Glowforge forums, and it was really easy to figure out how to set it. I didn't even actually do a test cut. This was my first go, and it came out great. I love the matte finish that comes from doing the engraved cut, and when you cut plexiglass with a laser, it actually flame polishes the edges, so the edges are super shiny too. One thing to note is that if you're gonna buy plexiglass, you wanna make sure and get cast acrylic, not extruded. This was a small test, but it definitely proves that I can do some really interesting things with acrylics. I want to experiment with this more, but for now, it just looks great on my keyboard. Super practical, and it actually looks like it was made by the factory, which I love. So up until this point, I've been working with 1/4 inch, 1/8 inch materials. Most of the stuff is pretty thin and easy to cut, but I wanted to test out how Glowforge works on hardwoods. This is a piece of ash that I've had laying around the shop for a little while. It's a really dense hardwood. It's what they make baseball bats out of. And these resawed pieces are cut down to about 3/8 of an inch or 10 millimeters. I decided to book match these boards, and in order to do that, I need a nice clean edge, so I jointed it on my table saw. Book matching is a process where you cut a board down the middle and open it up, and as a result, the grain reflects on both sides. You can see that cathedral pattern shows up on both sides, so it's a nice, even-looking board, and the grain matches up in the center. With a little bit of tape and some wood glue, I can press it together and join that edge. I also add a bit of clamping pressure with my Rockler Surefoot clamps. After about an hour, I can scrape off the excess wood glue and remove them from the clamps. Then I took them over to the drum sander to make sure they were nice and flat. As I mentioned before, you can buy the backing paper. It's the same stuff that they use on the proof grade material. You can buy it in rolls. Just make sure that your surface is nice and clean. You squeegee out all the air bubbles and cut off the excess. Back in the office, I put the panel into the Glowforge and then opened up the Glowforge app to prepare a little test. I wanted to see if it could actually cut through this material. I had a little bit of doubt from the research that I'd done. I didn't know if it could do it in one pass, so I decided to set the cut setting to the full power and then reduce the speed to the slowest speed, so it'd have the best likelihood of cutting all the way through. So my first cut was slightly misaligned for some reason, but it did manage to cut all the way through, which was awesome. It was not, however, the cleanest cut. You can see there's a lot of char on the back side. So I decided to mess around with the settings a little bit more and run multiple tests using a couple of different variables. I slowed down the speed for the second cut, and that didn't go all the way through, so I added a second pass, and then I kind of had to keep adjusting the speed. But once I got up to the 130 mark, it seemed to be the sweet spot. It was cutting all the way through, but it was about as clean as I could get it. As you can see on the back side, there's not as much scorching as there was the first go round. So I'm sure you're wondering what I'm going to be using these panels for. I'm actually going to make some clock faces because I need a clock in both my office and in the wood shop. I started designing in my sketchbook and then quickly moved into Adobe Illustrator. Illustrator is one of my favorite programs for vector-based work. There's definitely a learning curve to it, but in terms of its versatility, it's really worth taking the time to learn it if you find yourself doing this kind of work. Once I designed a couple of clock faces, I picked my favorite ones and then made the alterations necessary so that it would work with the Glowforge. So I brought the first file over into the Glowforge app, but I wasn't super confident that it was going to center itself well. I centered it on a center line that I had drawn on the actual panel, but I noticed that the camera isn't perfect. I saw that with the drift. You can see on the left side the drifting circles. Those were not quite right. So I decided to do like a ghost cut on here, dialed the laser back to almost nothing, and I could see how far off it was. Then I adjusted it slightly in the program without moving the panel or anything, and then cut it again with the full intensity, and that seemed to work out pretty darn well. I would caution folks that if it's really critical to get your image aligned perfectly with the material, that you do some setup steps, just ensure that it gets it right. This, as you can see, is still not perfect. I probably could have spent a little more time getting it centered, but it was close enough for this purpose. I was extremely happy with these results. It cut through great, and the settings seemed to be exactly right. Now it's time for the moment of truth to see whether this thing can cut pattern plywood. I had this idea of adding a little sub-dial onto the clock face out of pattern plywood. I thought it would be really cool, so I traced it out and then brought it into the program. As you can see, there's still a bit of distortion because I know that circle's the right size, but the camera doesn't read it quite right. So I did another ghost cut to see where it was lining up, and it was the right size, but it was a little bit far over to the right. That was easy to fix in the program. I nudged it back over, and then I tested out some settings. This panel is about a ½ an inch thick, so I knew that it was going to struggle to get through it. I actually added 3 passes and got a warning that it was going to get too hot, that it might catch on fire. I decided to risk it and go for it, and you could see quite a bit of burning going. I monitored it the entire time. I've got a fire extinguisher in the office, but fortunately it didn't catch on fire. Now to see if it actually pops out, it didn't. It did seem to cut all the way through, somewhat. You can see it left kind of little dots all the way around. So I wondered if I took a sander to it, that if I could sand deep enough to relieve that piece. After quite a bit of sanding, it wasn't releasing, and I tested out an X-Acto knife that didn't seem to even do it that well, and after getting a little bit frustrated, I ended up taking it over to the table saw. Now this kind of defeats the purpose a little bit. Maybe it's that the pattern plywood is too thick, so I'm gonna try again, but this definitely did not yield a clean cut, and ultimately I had to go to the bandsaw and then over to the sander to clean that up. One good thing is that it did not scorch the surface, even though I cranked it up to that really high temperature. The face and the back were nice and clean. I removed the transfer paper from the clock face and tested the fit. Unfortunately, because of all the sanding and everything, it was a pretty loose fit, but I had an idea for how to fix it. I cut a spare piece of black veneer, the same black veneer that's in the pattern itself, and then glued it to the outside, holding it into place with a rubber band. While that dried, I decided to give the clock face a little more dimension by running it through a router. After that, I gave it a quick sanding along the edges and on the face, and stained it black with some India ink. I thought this would look good because it would match the black in the pattern plywood. I liked the look of the rounded edges of the clock face so much, I decided to actually round the pattern plywood. I was worried that I would destroy the plywood if I send it through the router, plus this is a little bit small, so I just did it by hand with a rasp and some sandpaper. The cool thing about the laser cutter is that it doesn't have much of a kerf, so all the parts that I cut out of the board just fit right back into place. I reused these markers from the original board, and since they're not stained, they stand out from the background. I also cut a couple extra MDF spacers to go behind them so that they stick a little bit proud of the surface. For the Almfab A that goes at the 12 o'clock position, I saved the middle piece, stained that, and then glued that to a backer board, and then glued the central piece to that, and then glued it into the back panel. It ended up looking super clean. The pattern plywood subdial got the same treatment, except for this time I stained the backer black so that you couldn't see it through the holes in the pattern plywood. Once it was glued onto the backer, I could insert it into the clock face. Clock phase number 2 is going to be a little bit different than the first one, and I'm going to start by setting it up on the Glowforge and cutting out the panel. As you can see, I've got a little relief cut on the left-hand side, and that will get an insert of pattern plywood as well. Although the laser doesn't have much of a kerf, it does have a kerf. A kerf is the space that's left when something cuts through something else. So I was finding that this piece was actually a little bit loose when I just cut it exactly the same as the original drawing. So I made a couple of them that were incrementally larger so I could test each one and see how well they fit. The first one I'm testing is what basically came from the original drawing, and then the next one is very slightly scaled up by, what is that, 1/100 of an inch? And that fit really well. And then when I got up to 2/100 of an inch, that was when it was a little bit tight, and then the 3/100 of an inch did not fit at all. So I had my answer. I was going to go for the 2.01, and with that, I could start preparing the pattern plywood. So I was hopeful that thinning this pattern plywood out and then putting a backer on the other side might be the answer. So I did a couple test cuts, as I probably should have done on the original piece of pattern plywood, and I found that I could kind of get through it. but it still was having trouble for some reason. After doing a few more cuts, I found a setting that I felt pretty comfortable with that got really close but didn't really burn the backside of the pattern plywood. Then when I pulled it off the bed, I found something really interesting. It was actually leaving the glue behind. So it cuts through the wood just fine, but it seems like the area where the glue is wasn't holding. This did end up breaking apart pretty easily, a lot easier than the first one, and I was able to get it into place with just a slight bit of pressure. Since the pattern plywood is now thinner than the clock face, I glued on that test piece to the back side of it and then glued it into the clock face. This actually turned out to be almost the exact right thickness. It was a nice tight fit, and I was curious to see how much of a black line was actually going to show up after it's glued up. While I waited for the glue to dry, I started in on some other pieces. The markers around the clock, I didn't want to do exactly the same way as the other clock, so I decided to cut some extra material to put behind there and glue behind each marker so that it was just black. I cut it out of 2 pieces just to save on material, and then I carefully aligned that to make sure that the seam wasn't over the top of a marker. For the logo element, I didn't need the outside of it, but I did need the inside to line up neatly. So I taped to the outside of the outer piece some blue tape and then inserted the middle piece with some CA glue and some accelerator. Once that was dry, I could use the blue tape to extract the outer piece, and it was perfectly centered. Next up is to apply finish to these clocks, and for that I'm using Bumbleshoot's Shop Wax. This came to me in a care package from Bumbleshoots, and it's my first time using it. It's all natural, it doesn't have any solvents in it. It's mostly made from beeswax is my understanding. It smells amazing, it's safe on your hands, and it looks great too. So thanks, Bumbleshoots. For the mechanics of the clocks, I bought a couple of inexpensive movements on Amazon. I'll link to them down below. They're nothing fancy. They come with a whole bunch of different hands. I thought about making my own hands, but I think they have to be extremely light. So these punched metal hands work well with these movements. If you wanted to make your own, it'd probably be better to buy a more expensive kit. Well, I have to admit that I was overwhelmed by this machine. I've been using it, I've been shooting this video for 3 months now, and finally have, well, I mean, I just had too much footage. I just kept making more projects and didn't know where to stop. So we're stopping here, but I did want to show you some of the things that I've been working on in the background. These are pattern plywood designs for the new version of the Murphy bar, which will be coming out next year. And this is just a draft, so I can send it to another company and we can make the grates out of brass, which I think is so cool. Speaking of brass, I have not yet etched brass, which I really want to do, but I came up with this design idea this morning of just making rulers, like my own designed ruler, and all you need is this spray, which I'll post a link down below. There's sprays for metal, there's sprays for ceramics. My buddy John Kaipoff has a bunch of videos on all the different materials that you can use in this machine, which is super cool. I'll post a link to his videos as well. And yeah, once again, I've got the discount code. If you are interested in adding this to your workshop, it's the biggest discount that you can get from Glowforge. So it's glowforge.com/Michael saves you up to $500 off, and it benefits my channel, which I really appreciate. Big thank you, as always, to my Patreon supporters. You guys are the best, and I'll catch you on the next one.
And an all-day scratch menu. Hours and online ordering at SabineSeattle.com.